Welcome to the cinema of Gothic horror. My name is Mark Harwood. What is Gothic horror? Well, according to Wikipedia, Gothic horror is a subgenre of horror fiction that emerged in the 18th century and is characterized by its focus on atmosphere, suspense, and the exploration of dark themes like death, fear, and the supernatural. But we also know Gothic horror sometimes can be costume melodramas with coach and horses, vampires, ghouls, ghosts. And of course, Gothic horror can take place in modern days. Look at Dark Shadows when it first came on in 1966. Barnabas Collins was a modern-day vampire, and then the stories would sometimes go back in time to 1795 or 1840. What we're going to do on Cinema of Gothic Horror is to look at some of the films that have filled us with fear, suspense, and dark themes. We're going to look at the Hammer horror films, some of the Amicus films, the old Universal films with Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi. And there are others also. And some of the stars who were in these pictures, like Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Vincent Price, Lon Chaney Jr. For our first film of this podcast, I decided to look at Hammer Films' last Frankenstein film. Why? Because I just felt like it. That was Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. Now, that was actually made in 1972, but not released until 1974. The first Frankenstein Hammer film, which really renewed the Gothic horror film, because remember, the last ones, would have been Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, the Universal horror films. And then you had the films that were made by Val Lewton, like I Walk with a Zombie, The Cat People. So Curse of Frankenstein brought in vivid color, a tale of the Frankenstein monster with Peter Cushing, written by Jimmy Sangster. Then there was Revenge of Frankenstein in 1959, going into the 60s, a reboot with Evil of Frankenstein, followed by Frankenstein Created Woman. The next film in the series was Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, which is always touted as the next best Frankenstein film after Curse of Frankenstein. It is very good, because the Baron was a real shit in that one. And then in 1970, you had a reboot, Horror of Frankenstein, not with Peter Cushing, but with Ralph Bates, who came on the scene with Taste the Blood of Dracula, and they were grooming him to be a new Hammer horror star. And then finally, in 1972, it was decided to kind of go back in time. What happened was, in 1969, 1970, 71, Hammer turned towards more nudity, more graphic horror. So now it was also time for the first main director, Terence Fisher, who had directed Curse of Frankenstein, followed up by Horror of Dracula and Revenge of Frankenstein, and a lot of those 50s films to the early 60s. In the late 60s, he got hit like 2 times coming out of a pub. I know he was supposed to direct the third Dracula film in the series, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and he couldn't do that. So with Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, it was now going back to the 50s in a way. You had Peter Cushing reprising the Baron, James Bernard, the great James Bernard, who was the composer of so many of the Hammer scores. He was only used a few times in the 70s for Taste the Blood of Dracula, Scars of Dracula, and then finally this film, and then Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Then you would have some actors who you would see in the 50s Hammer films, like Charles Lloyd Pack as Professor Durandale. It is his brain that's used in The Monster from Hell. He's a great musician and mathematician. Patrick Troughton as a body snatcher at the very beginning. You saw him in Curse of Frankenstein. You hear his voice and you see his hands. He was also in The Gorgon. Madeline Smith, who didn't have to take her clothes off like she did in Vampire Lovers, was in the film. You had a newcomer named Shane Bryant, who also Hammer was trying to make into a major star. And of course, Peter Cushing as Baron Victor Frankenstein. In Revenge of Frankenstein, he used the pseudonym Dr. Stein, and in this, he was now Dr. Carl Victor. Shane Bryant is a young doctor who has the books that Baron Frankenstein wrote. He's a young doctor trying to emulate his hero, Victor Frankenstein. Patrick Troughton, as a body snatcher, brings him a body. Basically, it's found out what Shane Bryan is doing, and he is brought to court and is sentenced to 5 years in a sanitarium. Well, he goes there and finds out that Baron Frankenstein is an inmate there also. But as it turns out, the Baron really is in charge there, because the head of the sanitarium, Herr Klaus, is kind of a perverted kind of guy. He's always fooling around with the female inmates. And also, as the Baron tells the story later on, he tried to rape his own daughter, Sarah, played by Madeline Smith. Also, Dave Prowse plays the monster. He played the monster in Horror of Frankenstein. That's the one with Ralph Bates. And now he plays the monster from hell, who his name is Herr Schneider. And as the Baron says, he is a throwback to a Neolithic type of man. Also of note is, a few years after Frankenstein and the monster from hell, Dave Prowse would play Darth Vader in the Star Wars films. What I like about this film is that there are no subplots like you have in Frankenstein Created Woman. It is basically the Baron trying to do the work that he has been doing for so many years, but always one failure after another. And he's trying to create the perfect man. Now, as I mentioned, in Curse of Frankenstein, Christopher Lee, who played the monster, was pretty ugly. But the next film, Revenge of Frankenstein, the monster, as played by Michael Gwynn, was a good-looking fellow until his brain is messed up. The next film, Evil of Frankenstein, was really a reboot. It was going more for the look of the old Universal horror films. In fact, Kiwi Kingston, who was a wrestler, played the monster and had sort of a Karloffian makeup that resembled the original Frankenstein monster as played in films from the 30s into the 40s. The next film was Frankenstein Created Woman. Very enjoyable film. These later films were written by John Elder, whose real name was Anthony Hines, who was a major producer at Hammer, who left in the late 60s but would write some of the films, as he did for Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. That was one thing they couldn't get Jimmy Sangster back to write. He was now directing and producing and doing some writing. Now you had this film where the Baron has a body because Herr Schneider tried to escape from the asylum and fell down onto the spiked fence down below, tearing out his eyes. The Baron gives him new hands, and the person that came from was Bernard Lee, who played M in the James Bond films. And as I mentioned, the brain was taken from Professor Durandale, played by Charles Lloyd Pack. At first, all seemed okay, but unfortunately, the brain started to sour, because one of the things Herr Schneider loved to do was to take glass and to put it into people's faces. There are some great set pieces here. When the monster from hell, his mind now reverting back to Herr Schneider and not Professor Durandale, is going throughout the asylum. He goes into the yard where the cemetery is, and he digs up the grave of Professor Durandale because he knows that was where the brain came from. And Herr Klaus, the head of the asylum, goes to a window in his office that's curtained, and all of a sudden it smashes, and Herr Schneider, Professor Durandale, the monster from hell, comes in, and he recognizes Klaus because he tried to rape his own daughter. He takes a broken bottle of bourbon and smashes it into his neck. This film did have some scenes that were cut out for the American release, such as the one I just mentioned. It was kind of graphic, with blood spitting out, but there was a very interesting scene where Dr. Helder is trying to graft the hands on the monster from hell. He's having trouble doing it. He can't hold the vein and stitch it on. So in a scene that was cut, Baron Frankenstein gets on his knees and he holds the vein in his mouth so the doctor can do his stitching. The reason being is his hands were burnt, because in the last film with Peter Cushing, Frankenstein must be destroyed, at the very end, the monster carries the Baron into a burning house. He has gloves on his hands. But what's interesting is that at the end of Evil of Frankenstein, this castle is blown up. So in the next film, Frankenstein Created Woman, his hands have gloves on them. They were burnt. So he has Thorley Walters helping him because his hands are burnt. But the next film, Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, his hands are fine again. As I mentioned, he was taken into the burning house by Professor Richter, played by the great Freddie Jones. So it was interesting because in one film his hands are burnt, and in the next film his hands are not burnt. But you know what? Hammer would do whatever it needed to do to make that particular story come alive. So Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, very enjoyable Hammer film, and also it was really an ending to the series. Because after the monster is killed by the inmates, well, now Frankenstein, Sarah, and Dr. Helder are back in his surgery, and Helder says, Baron, the monster is dead. And Frankenstein says, well, the best thing that ever could have happened to him. And he decides that now he's going to go back and look for new raw materials. And the camera tracks back through the windows, and you see the bars of the windows, and the Baron is placed behind the bars. And basically, he's kind of flipped his lid the way he's talking. He's all happy and giddy, and that's how the film ends. And truthfully, it was a great way for the Frankenstein series that Hammer did so beautifully would come to an end. You really didn't have an ending for the Dracula films. And we'll talk about them in other cinema of Gothic horrors. We'll talk about some of the other Frankenstein films. So until next time, my name is Mark Harwood, and this is the Cinema of Gothic Horror.